Okay, so this is my talk, Vibing Your Way Through the Enterprise. A bit about myself before we get started. My name is Matthew Edelberg. I'm a senior security consultant for Optiv in their attack and penetration team. My role is primarily red teaming, enemy threat replication, internal, external threats, spear phishing, that type of stuff. And that's kind of where a lot of this talk kind of was created from the experiences that we see. So, to begin, I like to use this diagram as a great way to explain like the current trends that we see as threat replicators. You can see at the bottom the attackers who are successful, as well as the ones that are caught. When I try to use this analogy, it's more so to illustrate the fact is that network defenses are great. They are catching a lot of important attacks, but there's still many that get through, and companies are unaware of it. And because of this trend is becoming more and more common that companies are being popped or compromised without being aware of it until information kind of gets leaked out, maybe sensitive stuff is showing up on public sources. And it kind of has changed how people kind of accept the fact that it's not a matter of if their company and organization is going to get compromised, it's a matter of when. And the simple fact is attackers will always find a way in. Spear phishing campaigns have always been successful. They always will be. All it takes is one user to click on a link and someone's in. We still see weak passwords prevalent still in the year 2018. Using the season in the year as a password structure. That is quite easy to figure out, and we still have high success. As well as we all know that there are constant security flaws, 0 days, misconfigurations that are always going to exist as products change, new features get added, they don't get properly vetted. So, lateral movement. Once an attacker or an adversary has gotten in, they need to figure out where they're going to go. How do they achieve their goal? Is it acquiring, business-related data, trade secrets, credit card data? They need to know how to get there. They need to kind of know how to get from point A to point B. And it's usually typically through moving from one machine or system to another. And this is primarily using credentials. And these credentials are often used to, SMB, login, RDP, features that are built into Windows environments that are used for system administration, business functions. And they really are not bugs. They're features. And that's what makes it hard to kind of lock them down and prevent this type of movement, because they're really needed for business operations. So I like to think of lateral movement as a three-phase kind of technique. Your first phase is your domain reconnaissance. This is trying to figure out what's
There's been cases of Ebola going around. If you have a mild fever, sore throat, other symptoms, come and get some Lysol or Febreze. Carry on. We love you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. So, 3 phases of lateral movement, what I like to call. The first one is domain reconnaissance. That is looking to understand what is in the environment and what, permissions and objects are in there. We see that with like Windows core commands, net commands, PowerShell, even like the in-packet tool suite, NetView. And then the actual act of compromising systems. So that there's a lot of talk and research that's always been around about compromise, SpectreOps has just released a bunch of new tools for C# based WMI execution of payloads, and then acquiring credentials. That could be Mimikatz or any other tools. So compromising and credential theft have really been the focus of a lot of research and innovation. But this talk is really going to be focusing on the first phase. And I like to say it's a really important phase because without it, an adversary is just flying blind. They don't really know where to go or how to get there, and each time they do something, whether it be a query, maybe they access something, that's generating more anomalous traffic that can be detected and caught. So, I mentioned a little bit before, so domain reconnaissance is really just knowing what users exist, what groups exist, what permissions these users that are part of this group, what is their function, what systems are running in the environment, and what is their purpose. Do they store credit card data? Are they a jump box? Are they just a simple workstation? And looking at, the privileges, read-write access on shares, computers of each individual user, as well as who's logged in. Because as mentioned before, one of the major things is figuring out what credentials you need to get, so that way you can move laterally through. Maybe if you need to get more credentials that have higher level of privileges, you need to know where they're logged in order to steal them. So this is what it kind of looks like. You have your compromised box. Maybe it's a spearfish, maybe it's something. And from there you start doing some queries, some enumeration, trying to figure out who's logged in, what permissions you have as that current user, and where you need to go. And because of this type of frequency of these attacks, the philosophy of assume breach has becoming more and more adopted. And this philosophy is that your company is always being breached at some point. You're never not under attack. And that helps kind of change the landscape from a hardened shell with a GUI center where you just focus on your perimeter assets, but start looking at focusing on your defenses and improving your metrics so that way you can prevent threats once they're inside. So it really focuses on building up an organization's ability to rapidly detect threats, react to them to close them off, and figure out what data has maybe been tampered with, compromised, and that way you can then prevent this from happening in the future. And a lot of this comes from network behavioral tools, or commonly known as threat analytics. These tools and stuff have slowly been becoming more and more popular and becoming very commonplace in a lot of environments we've seen on red teaming gigs. They are different than like an endpoint virus or antivirus protection system because they're not just looking at like a signature base of like a payload or characteristic. They're looking at the behavior. Was there something where this kind of looks suspicious, or all of a sudden this user who has never logged into any of these systems or anything like that, or maybe doesn't log in on the weekends or doesn't ever put in extra hours, works 9 to 5. All of a sudden, they're starting to do a lot of work outside their normal hours. They're doing things that are kind of outside their normal behavioral profile. And that way, blue teams in defense can kind of target and be like, well, they're accessing or looking for things that they have no business doing. Maybe Sally from HR all of a sudden is looking at IT stuff and, credit cards. That's weird. So, some examples. So, net commands commonly being detected. We are able to figure out, what user was running under the system, and what commands were actually executed, and that's a great way for blue teams to kind of work backwards and create a timeline of where, what, and how. So a few more examples of other tools and systems you can see. Even common ones like PowerShells, like all those PowerShell, PowerSploit, all these things, they're slowly being caught more and more with more frequency. And as well as metrics to build profiles on users to kind of figure out what they're doing. So, with this paradigm shift, we've had, adversaries are becoming more sneaky, being more creative. They're moving away from just using raw command line tools, PowerShell, anything like that, because that's what a lot of signatures are based off. That's what a lot of anomalous things look for. Instead, they're going to this philosophy of living off the land. Using the example of net queries to gather users, permissions, who's a domain admin, who's a part of X group. So one example is looking at LDAP instead of using these commands. One of the reasons why LDAP is so good, is so widely used, is because much like these commands, anyone who has domain level credentials, if an adversary compromises them, can use these to run up these queries. Same type of way, same type of function as the PowerShell or command line, but it's just hard to detect. And the problem with that is after the initial authentication request, whether it be successful or not, no further alerts are triggered. So there's very little monitoring or event tracking after this fact. So queries can pass through that were normally being detected through command line or PowerShell, but through LDAP. And unfortunately, the only way with these types of queries is if you are able to monitor the traffic and see the clear text packets, because it's all sent over over no encryption, you're able to see these types of queries. But by simply adding a layer of encryption, it obfuscates all this information, making it impossible for defense to detect. So to give you an example, kind of comparison, what it would kind of look like is an adversary would get in, they start running these queries, but it looks suspicious. So these logs then get forwarded to a security center or an agent, and it generates an alert that is then sent to defense, and they are able to investigate and shut it down before the compromise has more time to move. Versus doing a bulk query over TLS encryption, and then reviewing the data locally, never generating any further requests or anything like that on the environment. Those logs are transferred over, but because all it was a simple LDAP request, no signature or alert is ever generated, so defense is never aware of it. Another technique that is being more and more used is going back to using low-level APIs, Windows APIs. And the reason for this is that these APIs are all designed to interact with specific functions in a Windows environment. And they're all on all systems, whether it be XP, 2003, they all come default. So adversaries know that they exist and that they are there. And these APIs are frequently used for normal operations, normal business functions. So it allows for their traffic to blend in with normal operations, making it even harder for blue teams to detect and kind of narrow in. So one example of the APIs that are commonly used is the NetShare API. So this API allows to query and pull down a tremendous amount of information about the remote shares running. And this can be from just the simple name to the description to the privileges. Now, a lot of times adversaries will only focus on level 1 or level 2 because the sequential levels require further access, like permissions like power level user or admin administrative rights. But they can deduce the name as well as the information. And then to figure out the permissions, they simply can just use a technique where they would connect and see if they can read anything off the share. And if they can, they then move into another phase where they go to test to see about write access. So with write access, it always involves trying to write something to disk. And with endpoint solutions becoming more and more advanced, it's harder and harder to drop a binary, drop a file without being detected. So one of the ways to go around this is to drop a folder. A folder still requires the same level of permissions to write. However, they don't carry any data. So with that in mind, you could drop a folder to test the write access. However, you don't actually, there's no like binary, there's no signature related to a folder, so it makes it harder for endpoint solutions to detect that this folder was being created. Another API call, this one, this is the abbreviation term, but it's Net Workstation User Enumeration. This API focuses on looking and basically displaying all information related to active sessions. And it does this by looking at all active tokens, which are created when a user logs in, maybe a service starts up, or a remote session connects, like through RDP. The one caveat with this API call is that you require elevated privileges on the system to actually see this type of information. Which brings us to the most commonly used one, Net Session Enumeration. So this is similar to the API call I just talked about. However, it doesn't require any administrator rights. You just have to be a domain user in order to query this information. So long as you have valid credentials for the environment, you can see whoever's logged in. However, there are some concerns and issues with this API call. It's becoming very, very popular to use. Numerous tools out there that are publicly released are constantly using this. So it's really easy for vendors to kind of write signatures and detect this. So what does that mean for adversaries? They hardly use that Net Session API call. Instead, they use a combination of looking at the share permissions as well as the workstation enumeration API call. And just sparingly ever have to call that net session enumeration API, because while they might write signatures for it, it is still a basic function in a Windows environment that has a business need. So by by using these steps, adversaries are making it harder and harder for defense to detect their actions. So Vibe, I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that this talk was called Vibing Your Way Through. So I developed a framework that takes all those components and steps that I just discussed and allows you to kind of carry this out. This is a tool that is mainly designed for not only red teamers, but also blue teamers. It pulls down the entire domain, that's users, groups, and systems, pulls down all the information about each object through LDAP. It allows you to do queries and connections between data sets. So it allows you to kind of understand why user X is part of this group and what does that group do in an environment. It allows you to scan for privileges, read, write. There you go. As well as look to see if you have administrator privileges. Using that user, you can actually then see who's logged in. We've tested this against numerous vendor products and to validate the effectiveness. This tool does not use any PowerShell. It uses primarily Python to interact with the Windows APIs. So I have a demo here to kind of show you an example of how it would work. So right now it's pulled down the whole domain information, so you can use similar commands like net, user, or anything like that to display the list of groups, the information that are normally queried and pulled down. So you can see every single group, who they're affiliated with, like the SID, all this information. And you can do this through users, groups, computers, you can see also the affiliated members, like the permissions that each computer, if a computer is assigned a group as part of a group, you can pull that information down. You also can see the list of file shares. That's kind of enumerated based on the information that's pulled down through group and user profiles. We also can pull down the password policy, so we can understand, what's their lockout threshold, how many times, how often are passwords changed. As we mentioned before, you can use net commands like, net user and display the same information you would if you were through a Windows command prompt. You can add multiple credentials, so that way you can use, as you get and pillage more credentials, you can actually switch between to see what privileges and shares you have access to. So in this example, we did only have one set of credentials. So we're going to scan this range, looking to see what shares exist, as well as the permissions that are associated. So this has a function to randomize each request, so that way it's not going in sequential, as well as you can add a jitter time to kind of delay and stagger the requests. So that way it's not like at this second that 1 was hit, then .2 was hit, then .3. Once you have this information, you can then also, as I mentioned before, use the session command to see who's currently logged in. So in the previous case, we know that 1760, 41, 190 we had write permissions to, so we can see who's logged in. Let's say now we've compromised the box, so we can now add those credentials. So we can add the domain, the username, you can add the password, or you can specify a hash if you weren't able to get the clear text password. You can still use the password hash instead. So now with that one added into the database, we can then see what new privileges this user has. But first, let's take a look and see. We can see that they're part of server 01 admin. So as I mentioned before, you can do these kind of queries to connect different data sets. So we're going to search for SL server, and we can see that there's an admin group and a server that's called server 01. So using these credentials, we're going to see who's logged in. And then from that point, we can just move forward. So how can we combat this? How can blue teams combat against this? Simply with pulling down LDAP traffic, it's kind of hard to monitor, and you can't really disable it. You should be able to. What we recommend is to monitor for large anomalous requests, maybe large queries or frequent queries, as well as if you have the ability to segment off your domain controllers and only allow access to certain resources to LDAP. For net share, that one's kind of hard because of the fact that how core and how key it is to an environment. I like to recommend to defense and blue teams to, instead of looking at everything, focus down on the important ones. Admin, $, C$, and any ones that store business data, as admin and C are used for code execution, primarily, remotely. So that way you can kind of focus in and look to see if any requests have been triggered against them, as well as implementing host-based firewalls. Net session, it's actually really easy to prevent. I'm actually surprised. Microsoft has actually released a lot of information about this, but we still see it prevalent. Just by changing this registry key here, you can change it to administrator, server, or power users, and that prevents anyone from being able to query to see who's logged in. So to recap, as the landscape has changed, adversaries are coming up with new ideas. And blue teams need to continue focusing on stopping them at the domain reconnaissance point to prevent further compromise. Vibe, which is the framework, can be used by both blue teams and red teams. Red teams to help show risk and impact, and blue teams can use it against their own appliances to help tune up and find where there are shortcomings. Vibe is publicly available now. It's just been released today here at GrrCon. The link is up there. I'll be constantly developing and adding it, so if you have any questions or anything like that, you can follow me on Twitter or just put a complaint or something on the GitHub. Are there any questions? Yes. Right now, you can add both, but some of the functionality, so you would have to first initiate the framework with domain credentials, but once you get in to it, like once you get into that command prompt where you saw the little triangles, you can use any credentials. Sorry, his question was, can you use local credentials and domain credentials, or is it only restricted to domain credentials? Yes. Pardon, sorry. I'm not at liberty to really talk about that. That's something where I'm just not comfortable saying. I'm not going to get into one of those matches. No other questions? Okay. Thank you.